to our session on idealism, panpsychism, and pan-proto-psychism. So these are all important views in the philosophy of consciousness, especially in the metaphysics of consciousness, thinking about the place of consciousness in the universe and its place in the natural order. Many people are drawn to the idea that consciousness is somehow fundamental. Actually, I once heard a saying. It says, you start off as a materialist, then you become a dualist, and inevitably you turn into a panpsychist, and you wind up as an idealist. So each of us are in like different places on this stage. Some people may be stuck back at page 1. Other people may have gone all the way through. Here we're going to hear from different people at different points in this progression. I guess the idea is, first of all, consciousness in the physical world. Yeah, well, physics is good, so materialism. Hey, consciousness is impressive. So dualism, hard to see how you could reduce it. Then how do you connect the two? Maybe consciousness is everywhere. It's got to go very deep in the natural order. So the physical world may be ultimately mental, so panpsychism. But then, why really do we need anything but consciousness? Idealism. So panpsychism, consciousness is everywhere. Even particles are conscious. Idealism takes the extra step to say consciousness is all there is, and the whole universe is conscious. Pan-proto-psychism is a variation that says proto-consciousness is everywhere, and consciousness gets built up from there. So for this session, we have, I think, a representative, in some ways, of each of this view. In order, we have a representative of idealism, a representative of panpsychism, and a representative of pan-proto-psychism. So I think this is going to be very interesting. Our first speaker is a very promising young man who's been doing some extremely interesting work, and from the background of medicine, bringing to bear on consciousness, now connecting to philosophy. He's setting out with some very promising articles on this point of view, and he may have maybe just on his way to writing his 80th book. One of the most recent books he wrote actually was called You Are the Universe, which has a very idealistic sound to it. It also implies either that you are much bigger than you thought you were, or that the universe is much smaller than you thought it was. I'm still not completely sure which one, but I'm looking forward to hearing about his view in this talk. Please welcome Deepak Chopra.
Thank you, David. Actually, I've taken that journey myself, the one you just mentioned, starting from physicalism to panpsychism, idealism, non-duality. I want to start by saying that today is very special for me because of this man sitting right next to you, David, Dr. Seymour Reichlen, who is 94 plus and was my professor when I was doing neuroendocrinology in the late 70s. Dr. Reichlen was president of the Endocrine Society. He's a legend. When he found a snake in his garden, he would dissect the brain to look at neuropeptides. And his fellowship was the most regarded fellowship in the United States. So I'm very honored that you're here, sir, Dr. Reichlen. And we got to catch up about all these issues. So this makes, by the way, your clock is not on. The timer is not on. Can you put the timer on so I don't exceed my time? So going back to this journey, neuroendocrinology, it was then that I got interested in the whole mind-brain problem because Dr. Reichlen and many luminaries at that time were describing what everybody knows about today, the neuropeptides, neurotransmitters in the brain, which now, of course, we know exist everywhere, not just in the brain, but your gut, your microbiome. In fact, it's difficult to say where the brain is anymore because your gut has a brain, your heart has a brain. Even your microbiome produces more serotonin than your brain does. So the field has expanded. And my interest was in these so-called molecules of emotion. Because even in the beginning, I realized that these separations between mind, body, brain, and the physical experience of the world were possibly just reductionist constructs that we had come up with. That, in fact, what we call mind, brain, body, and physical universe were a unified experience. Where else? In consciousness. So that's how I got interested in consciousness. I made the journey that David mentioned, from physicalism to dualism to panpsychism to idealism, and now to what I call non-duality. Thanks to David, everyone's now totally familiar with the phrase hard problem, the hard problem of consciousness. And thanks to that one phrase, there's a lot of conversation going on in the world right now about what is consciousness, and where is consciousness, and what is it doing. So thanks for coming up with that phrase, hard problem of consciousness. So what I'm about to say is that the hard problem of consciousness is insolvable if you have what we call a physicalist ontology. If you think that the fundamental reality of the universe is physical matter, then we have a problem. And we've basically been discussing this in these conferences, which started off as the science towards the science of consciousness. Now it's called the science of consciousness. And I hope in the future we'll call this conference Science in Consciousness, because science is a particular methodology in consciousness. It's a very good methodology, but after all theories are conceived in human consciousness. All experiments are designed in human consciousness. And all experiences, observations, are made in consciousness. So science is a particular methodology for trying to understand what we call reality, but it's still a system of thought. Just like we've had other systems of thought. We've had mythology, we have had religion, we've had philosophy, theology. Science is also a system of thought. And until we know what a thought is, then we are not actually dealing with reality, or not trying to figure it out. We're creating models of reality. So what is thought? And what is its relationship to what we call everyday experience? Now, as we look at the literature on consciousness, there are many definitions of consciousness. So one definition of consciousness is that it's first-person experience. Another definition of consciousness, which is more popular in the world I inhabit of non-dualists, is that consciousness is the knowing element in every experience. The knowing element in every experience. Right now, you're having an experience in consciousness, and you also know that you're having an experience in consciousness. Many people in spiritual traditions, particularly in the East, Eastern philosophical systems, such as Rupert Spira and many others, will define consciousness as that in which all experience occurs, but also that in which all experience is known. And also that, and you hinted at that in the introduction, out of which all experience is made. So consciousness is that in which all experience occurs, is that in which all experience is known, and out of which all experience is made. I'd like to go even further, deeper, in saying that consciousness is the potential for experience in all living species. So in many wisdom traditions in the world, what we call biological organisms are referred to as sentient beings. Even a plant is a sentient being. So is a microbe. And now, I was just having a conversation with Anil Seth this morning, and kind of jokingly said that human consciousness is the awakening of bacterial consciousness, because we have 99% more genomic information from bacteria than we have from the human genome in our body. Right now, 99% of the genetic information in your body is not human, but bacterial. But leave that aside. Consciousness is the fundamental, primitive, ontological reality which makes any experience possible. The experience of a human. The experience, this phrase has become very popular. What is it like to be a bat? What is it like to be a snake that knows reality through the experience of infrared? What is it like to have the experience of a honeybee that can tell in 30 seconds or less through a waggle dance where to go for honey and where to find it? After all, other species have experiences too. Their experiences are not only unknown to us, but unknowable to us. Every species, and within the species, has disparate experiences. So what is that fundamental reality in which all experience occurs? Not only human experience, but experience of that other species have. We cannot deny that other species have experiences. They respond to the environment, they have sex, they move away from toxins in the direction of what we would say homeostasis or self-regulation. So if I were to define consciousness, I would say it's the knowing element in every experience, in every species. And that what we call biological organisms are actually species of consciousness. Now, one species, Homo sapiens, turns out to be a very interesting species. If you look at deep history, and you look at some of the things that have been written by deep historians, including this most recent book, Sapiens, by Yuval Harari, he talks about 3 or 4 different eras of development in what we would call human cognition. So he and others say that something called the cognitive revolution occurred about 30 to 60,000 years ago. About 30 to 50,000 years ago, there were possibly 8 different types of humans. So we are Homo sapiens, which means literally a name we gave to ourselves, the wise ones. There were other species of humans, Homo neanderthalis, Homo florensis, Homo habilis, Homo erectus. They all were the same family, but different species. A species is defined as an organism that only mates within its own kind. Just like you have the cat family, but the cat family includes lions, tigers, and panthers, and cheetahs, and your house cat. They're all different species. So like that, there were about 8 or so human species. And one species developed a language first for gossip, and then for stories. And that was us. And because of our imagination, we were able to get rid of the other species because leaders, human beings, Homo sapiens, who could create the best stories, became very powerful leaders. And that was the beginning of colonialism, the beginning of empires, the beginning of nation states, the beginning of the concept of money, the beginning of commerce, and ultimately led to the scientific revolution, which happened only 500 years ago. And science has been amazingly successful. Right now, everything we're doing is based on science, whether you surf the internet, information highway on the internet, or send somebody email, or use any technology, and it's going even further with augmented reality, artificial intelligence, virtual reality. So the scientific revolution has been extremely successful. But it's still a story. And that story is conceived, constructed, organized, comes into existence in human consciousness. So in ancient times, people, when they spoke about reality, they said earth, water, fire, air, space, the 5 elements. Today, we don't use those words. We use the periodic table of elements. We have created taxonomy. We have created sciences like quantum physics, advanced mathematics. And where these sciences are leading us is beyond anything that was in mythical imagination. I just was speaking to my co-author on a different book, Leonard Mlodinow, who is recently in England right now at the funeral of Stephen Hawking. In their book, they propose 10 to the power of 500 universes, according to what is called M theory. 10 to the power of 500 universes is more mythical than anything I've read in any mythology. Okay. We are a speck of dust somewhere in the junkyard of infinity. According to current science, the latest scientific model, there are 2 trillion galaxies. That's the current estimate. Don't believe me, go check it out on the internet. 2 trillion galaxies, 700 sextillion stars, I don't even know how to write that, and uncountable trillions of planets, on one of which exists a species called Homo sapiens that is daring with this 3-pound piece of meat to solve the mysteries of the universe. That's an amazing and daunting and arrogant task, I should say. So let me share with you what I think is the journey we are undertaking. I will be bold enough to say that there is no such thing as a mind, that there is no such thing as a body, and there is no such thing as a universe. These are human constructs for modes of knowing and experience in this particular species of consciousness that we call Homo sapiens. If I asked you, what is this? Can you tell me what this is that I'm pointing to? Shoe, sneaker. What's this? What's this? What's this? Okay, so these are human constructs. All fundamental experiences that you and I are having right now, without the construct, is color, shape, form. And by the way, they are all the same thing. A form, a color, a shape is the same thing. The difference between this and this is color. If it wasn't for color, visually, you would have an experience of a homogeneous nothingness. So fundamental experience is color, shape, form, sound. Where are you having the experience of the sound? For lack of a better word, you have to say consciousness. There's no sound in your brain right now. Where are you having the experience of color? For lack of a better word, we have to say consciousness. There's no color in the brain. What's going to the brain is what we call an action potential. What's happening in the brain is the shift of ions across cell membranes. But you're having this experience, including the experience of your own body. You're having the experience of that which we call our body, that which we call our mind, that which we call the universe. But fundamental experience is sensations. And when I say sensations, all forms of sensations and sense perceptions. Fundamental experience is images. I ask you right now to imagine a beautiful sunset on the ocean. You're having an experience. Even though there's no image of a beautiful sunset in your brain. But I asked you to think of a sunset, and you modified what we call consciousness into that experience. And like that, we modify, as consciousness, everything into experience. Whether the experience of sensations, images, feelings, or thoughts. So I know this word qualia has been used many times now recently, again, thanks to people like David and others. But I'd like to extend this definition of qualia. And qualia are actually basically modified forms of consciousness. Qualia are everything that we can call a sensation, a sensory experience, an image, a feeling, a thought. And so you can experience qualia anytime, just with the flicker of an intention. I told you just now, think of a beautiful sunset on the ocean. You had an experience. If I ask you to think of the love that you have for your mother or your significant other, you have an experience. And all you need is a flicker of an intention. Consciousness is constantly modifying itself into qualities of consciousness that we call qualia, and then we give them constructs. This is a shoe. This is a microphone. No baby has the concept of a microphone or a shoe, or for that matter, of a hand or a body or of a universe. These are learned constructs in human consciousness in the same way that money is a human construct, in the same way that Wall Street is a human construct, in the same way as latitude and longitude are a construct, in the same way as, and now I'm risking dangerous territory, in the same way as gravity, or gluons, or particles, or force fields, or waves of potentiality. These are all human constructs for modes of knowing and experience. Are they useful? Of course they're useful for doing science. And science is the biggest adventure that consciousness has taken. But consciousness has taken other adventures. The experience of a plant, the experience of a microbe, unknowable to us, but we can see that there is some experience happening there. What does the world look like to an insect with multiple eyes? What does it mean to experience the echo of ultrasound or navigate experience through what we call infrared radiation? Aren't those themselves human constructs? Isn't infrared and ultraviolet and electromagnetism and force fields and particles human constructs? As soon as you give a name to an experience, you reify that experience into an object. All I'm experiencing right now is sensations, images, feelings, thoughts. That's it. And then I reify that Some I call mind, some I call body, and some I call the universe. When all there is happening is consciousness is having an experience of itself as this, as that, as all this, including the Milky Way galaxy. Consciousness is having an experience through a species of itself that we call Homo sapiens. But consciousness is having multiple, innumerable experiences. Consciousness is innumerable knowers, innumerable modes of knowing, and innumerable phenomena known, all within itself. Innumerable knowers. I consider myself an observer, a knower, an experiencer, having this experience right now. But this that I call body-mind is part of the experience. You can't have the experience of that, or the Milky Way galaxy, or of the body, except as a unified experience in consciousness. So consciousness is modifying itself as the observer, as the process of observation, and that which is being observed. Now, I don't know if this is a distinction between idealism or what we call non-duality. Maybe there isn't. Maybe idealism is the right word, or maybe non-duality, which goes a little further, which says what you said, David. There is only consciousness modifying itself as experience. Period. Consciousness modifies itself as a perception. And you know, there's so many ways of understanding consciousness, and they're all, I think, equally valid. There's the scientific methodology, which reifies experience into the objective world. Experience is very evanescent. Experience is very ephemeral. Experience is very transient. So if I asked you what happened to this morning, it's gone. But that's also true of your childhood, it's gone. It's also true of 5 minutes ago, it's gone. It's also true of a second ago. By the time my words reach you, that experience is over. So Wittgenstein is known for saying, we are asleep, our life is a dream. But once in a while, we wake up enough to know that we are dreaming. Buddha, who was the original consciousness researcher, I think, he said, this lifetime of ours is transient as autumn clouds. To watch the birth and death of beings is like looking at the movements of a dance. A lifetime is like a flash of lightning in the sky, rushing by like a torrent down a steep mountain. So I think systems of thought, whether they are religion, theology, philosophy, or science, can take us only so far. But then we have to transcend these systems of thought and know from our own direct experience that no experience that we have, whether it's of the body, or an experience in the mind, or an experience of whatever is happening, is actually tangible. You can't catch it. It's ungraspable. So humans, with their immense imagination and creativity, and their proclivity for creating models of reality, created the idea that there's a mind, there's a body, there's a universe, when all there is consciousness, and even that's a word. I have to use words. But remember, as soon as you use words, as soon as you describe, you're creating models of reality. I've asked this question of many times from many people, theoretical physicists and mathematicians. Where is mathematics? Where is the thought? Where is the color red? And these conferences, we discuss all this. And so all these models that we create have limits to them. Limits to our capacity for knowing, limits to that which we call the brain's ability to comprehend reality. Freeman Dyson, who's one of my most favorite authors, he said, and I hesitate to use the word God because it's such a loaded word, and we all have concepts about it, or no concepts about it, and we go to war based on those concepts. But Freeman Dyson said something very interesting in his book, Infinite in All Directions. He said, God, or the mystery of the universe, is what mind becomes when it passes the scale of our comprehension. The scale of our comprehension is limited by the species of consciousness that we are. A particular mode of knowing in almost innumerable phenomena known. So even in my own journey, I've traveled through these different models: brain, mind, mind-brain. I think we should be using brain, mind-brain in the same way we use mass, energy, or wave particle, or space-time. But what is underneath all of this? Underneath all of this is the desire to know, the curiosity we all have, the wonder we experience as kids before we are programmed into some very useful constructs that help us do science and astronomy and biology, and some pretty useless constructs like supernatural beings somewhere in outer space. So before I end, as I'm approaching the limits of my time allotted, realizing that time is also a construct, I would like you right now to answer yes to the following question that I'm going to ask you. Okay? The answer is yes. I'm giving you the answer before I ask you the question. So the question is, are you aware right now? A little more enthusiasm. Are you aware? Okay, now I'm going to ask you the same question, but don't answer it till I raise my hand. Are you aware? So are you aware is a thought. The answer, yes, is a thought. Awareness is where the thought arises, where it's known, into which the thought subsides. And that's the same nature of perception as well. So I'm going to say, once again, ask you, are you aware? And just be aware of that which is having this experience. Are you aware? This is the ontological primitive. It's formless, has no shape, no color, is not in time, occupies no space, but without it, there would be no experience. As Rumi said, God's language is silence. Everything else is poor translation. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions. We're going to take a couple of questions in 5 minutes after each of the talk, and then panel at the end. So if I see anyone, is there a microphone that anybody is at? There is? Okay, very good.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. Having met many people here and in similar conferences, it seems like mystical experiences have a profound impact on shaping people's reality tunnels. Has this been an influence on your own reality model, and do you think it's also treading like in dangerous territory because it's like straddling the borderline between maybe genius and insanity?
Well, I try to keep the company of sages, psychotics, and geniuses. It's a motley group, but I enjoyed that experience. I have had gut-wrenching doubts about what I know and what I don't know. every time I transition, it's a gut-wrenching experience. And I'm realizing that where I am now, where I believe that this experience that you're having right this moment is a lucid dream in a vivid now. And that vivid now is timeless. Time now is not a moment in time. I've never seen a moment show up from there, here, leave, followed by another moment. This is the dream that we call now.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your talk. Your voice is so soothing. I feel much more peaceful just having listened to you. But my question is you seem to have started your talk by placing limitations on the human species in terms of the consciousness of which we are capable of knowing. And yet at the conclusion of your talk, it seemed as though at the ontological primitive, there was a certain transcendence of the human condition. And I'm wondering if I'm reading you wrong, or if there's a barrier there or an avenue. How do you see that interface, sir?
I see that all I am capable of knowing is human modes of knowing. Perception for me and for all of us is a human mode of knowing. This is a human experience. Even the universe we are experiencing is a human construct in human consciousness. But I realized that you have to transcend that in order to understand consciousness, because this is only one mode of knowing and experience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, going to wrap things up there for now. Thanks very much. Okay, so our second speaker representing Panpsychism is Hedda Hassel Mørch. Hedda is a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness at New York University, where we've been lucky enough to have her for the last couple of years, and also at the University of Oslo. She's become very well known for her work on different aspects of the question of panpsychism, where she's, for example, put forward a view, the phenomenal powers view, where consciousness essentially has certain causal powers that helps explain its place in the natural order. She's also made some connections with Tononi's integrated information theory, and has said some very interesting things about the combination problem for panpsychism. I think that's going to be at the center of our talk today, which is panpsychism and the fusion view of mental combination. So please welcome Hedda Mørch.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'm just going to start. Panpsychism is the view that all physical things are associated with some form of phenomenal consciousness or subjective experience. And it's recently been argued that panpsychism might offer a solution to the hard problem of consciousness that avoids the main problems of rival views. But it faces its own combination problem that critics have argued is just as hard. In this talk, I'm first going to introduce panpsychism and its solution to the hard problem. Then I'm going to compare it briefly to its main rivals, including physicalism, dualism, and subjective idealism. Then I'm going to present the combination problem and the two main responses to it, constitutive and emergent panpsychism. I will then introduce a new version of the emergent view called the fusion view. This view has also been defended by Bill Seeger, who's also here at the conference. And I'm going to argue that the fusion view avoids the main problems of standard emergent panpsychism, as well as a number of other objections that I'm going to discuss. And at the end, I'm going to show that the fusion view can be combined with Tononi's integrated information theory, and that this could help render the view even more plausible. Okay, so panpsychism can be defined more precisely as the view that all physical things are either phenomenally conscious, which is to say that there is something that it's like to be that thing. And it also means that they're conscious as a whole, or that their experience is associated with a single point of view. And our brains are obviously conscious in this sense, and panpsychism takes fundamental physical entities such as particles to be conscious in this sense as well. So they have a very simple form of subjective experience that doesn't involve any self-reflection or self-awareness or thought or anything like that. It's more just like a very, very simple feeling. That's the idea. Things could also be made of parts that are all conscious. So a spoon, for instance, would not necessarily be conscious. Most panpsychists would deny that, but it will be made of conscious particles. And some things might just be part of a larger conscious whole. So a neuron in the brain might not have its own consciousness, and as I'll talk about later, an atom that forms part of the conscious part of the brain might also not be conscious, but it will then be sort of overlap with the consciousness of the larger brain area that it composes. So philosophers, including David Chalmers, Thomas Nagel, and Galen Strawson have all argued that panpsychism might be part of the solution to the hard problem of consciousness. And the most powerful case for this, I think, starts from the observation that all physical properties are purely structural or relational. So all physics tells us about the physical world is like how things behave or how they relate to other things, and not how they are in and of themselves. So, for instance, all physics tells us about the properties such as mass is that it's the property of attracting other things with mass or resisting acceleration and so on. So it only tells us about how massive objects behave or about their location in a purely causal or spatial structure. But it seems that this structure must be realized by some kind of stuff or substance that is itself not purely structural, or that these relations described by physics must hold between some things that are themselves, that have intrinsic properties that are independent of their relations. Otherwise, it wouldn't seem that this structure could exist really and concretely as opposed to purely abstractly as a purely mathematical or empty object. Then panpsychists point out that phenomenal properties seem intrinsic. We know something about what it's like to, for instance, see red or be in pain that's independent of how these experiences relate to causes in the physical world and how they relate to other experiences and so on. So for that reason, phenomenal properties can be posited as the intrinsic realizer of all physical structure. Or we could think that the relations described by physics hold between instances of phenomenal experience. And most of these experiences would then be very simple experiences associated with, for instance, particle. So another way of putting this point is that physics only gives us the pure software of reality. It's purely logical or dynamic structure. And then it turns out that consciousness is a bit more like hardware because it has these intrinsic concrete properties. So therefore, we might think of consciousness as the sort of hardware that implements the software of physics. So this is a bit ironic because in philosophy of mind, we're often told that it's the other way around, that the mind is like software and the brain is hardware, but panpsychism turns this completely around. And this enables a new response to the hard problem. So one way of putting the hard problem is how does consciousness arise from putting together non-conscious particles in some complicated way? And to this, panpsychists can simply respond that it doesn't. Particles are already conscious. But there's another way of putting the hard problem, which is why are some physical processes or entities, such as particles, associated with consciousness in the first place? And here the answer is that consciousness is the intrinsic realizer of physical structure. And physical structure needs some realizer, and consciousness is it. And this solution to the hard problem avoids the main problems of both physicalism and dualism. The main problem of physicalism is the epistemic gap from physical properties to consciousness. This can be illustrated, for instance, by the knowledge argument, in which Mary, who knows all physical facts about colors and color vision, still can't know what it's like to see red. And this seems to show that consciousness is not physical in the sense of being constituted by the kinds of properties described by physics. Dualism is the view that consciousness is non-physical, but connected to the physical world by fundamental causal laws. And dualism faces the problem of causal exclusion, which stems from how the physical world seems causally closed, or that every physical event that has a cause and, or is not indeterministic, that includes our own actions, it seems, have a sufficient physical cause. And this strongly indicates that phenomenal properties, if they are non-physical, would be epiphenomenal. And panpsychism is compatible with the epistemic gap because it denies that phenomenal properties are constituted by physical properties. It's rather the other way around. And this also gives consciousness an essential explanatory role, because without intrinsic realizers, physical causes couldn't even exist in the same way software can't really exist without hardware. And this role is also compatible with physical causal closure, because consciousness only realizes or fills in the physical structure that's already there. It doesn't add any extra structure as dualism or interactionism would, so the physical world will remain causally closed from a structural point of view. I also want to compare panpsychism to subjective idealism. This is the view that the physical world is merely a structure in the experiences of human and maybe other advanced minds. And I think this might be closer to Deepak's view, but I'm not sure. But we can maybe talk about that in the panel later. But in any case, the main problem of subjective idealism is that it implies a kind of anti-realism about the external world. It doesn't take the external world to really exist when nobody is having an experience of it. And this makes it very hard to explain why our experiences are so lawful and regular if they're not caused by an external world. If they're not caused by anything external, they should be just random or up to us, which doesn't seem to be the case. Panpsychism, in contrast, takes the physical world not as a structure in the experience of an observer, but rather to be a structure of experiences. And most of these experiences would be non-human, simple experiences associated with particles or other very simple entities. So it thereby preserves realism about the external world, because this structure would exist entirely independently of our experience. It only depends on the experience of the things in the structure. Okay, so in this way, panpsychism seems to avoid the main problems of the most important alternative positions, but in return, it gets the combination problem. And that's the problem of how complex consciousness of the kind we know from our own case, or we might call it macro consciousness, arises from putting together microconscious particles in some complicated way, or why some microphysical and microconscious processes are associated with macro consciousness. And this problem is very similar to the hard problem, as you can see, and as I said, many think it's just as hard. So the two main positions on this problem are constitutive and emergent panpsychism. Constitutive panpsychism takes macroconsciousness to be constituted by microconsciousness, which means that our experiences right now is nothing more than sort of a bunch of particle experiences instantiated next to each other in some complicated pattern or causally connected in the right way. And this view faces a version of the main problem of physicalism, namely that there seems to be an epistemic gap from any configuration of microconscious particles to macroconsciousness. In the same way, it seems like the existence of a group of minds never implies the existence of a group mind. So if you take a bunch of conscious people, no matter if we organize them as a corporation or something that seems to have a mind of its own, that doesn't make the group conscious. And in the same way, a group of particles, no matter how we organize them, that group won't be conscious as a whole automatically. So to avoid this problem, panpsychists could posit a fundamental law that connects some configurations of microconscious particles to macroconsciousness, which means that macroconsciousness will be strongly emergent. But this view faces a version of the main problem of dualism, namely that it seems that macroconsciousness would be explanatorily excluded by microconsciousness, because there doesn't seem to be any strongly emergent macro-physical structure in the brain. The brain is just a bunch of particles that don't produce any new entities when they come together and form a conscious brain. And all these particles will already be realized by their own microconsciousness. So that means that if these microparticles produce an extra distinct macroconsciousness, there will be no physical structure for that consciousness to realize, and it will be explanatorily redundant. So this brings us to the fusion view. This is a version of emergent panpsychism. It was first proposed by Bill Seeger, and I have also defended a version of it. On this view, when microconscious particles come together in the right way, their experiences fuse or blend into a single macro experience. And when this happens, the particles will lose their own individual consciousness or the borders around their experience, so that after the fusion, it's only the whole that's conscious. The parts are no longer conscious. So you can think of this as, by analogy, with drops of water. When 2 drops of water come together, they will fuse into a single drop. And the original drops will then lose their individual borders or surfaces. And after, there's only one new drop with a single border. And if this is how combination works, the world is a little bit like the picture on the right from the mental point of view. So the small drops would be tiny particle experiences. The medium drops might be experiences associated with molecules or cells if there are intermediate levels of combination that result from particle minds fusing. And then the big drops would be human and animal experiences that result from lots and lots of small, simple particle experiences having fused into one. So the fusion view avoids the main problems of standard emergent panpsychism. Because with this kind of emergence, the emerger replaces the base. So the new the macro-consciousness can't exclude micro-consciousness as a realizer of microphysical structure, because this micro-consciousness has disappeared by transforming into macro-consciousness. So then the new macro-consciousness can take over the previous explanatory role of its micro-conscious base as the realizer of the microphysical structure of the brain. So it thereby gets an explanatory role after all, despite being emergent and distinct from the experiences it emerged from. But the fusion view still has some other problems. And I'm now going to identify what I think the main problems are and then suggest some solutions to them. The first important problem for the fusion view is how a single fusion can realize all the particles in the brain. So Bill claims that fusions are large simples and that they're structurally analogous to black holes, which so when the black hole forms, all the characteristics of the constituents are sort of absorbed and disappear. But this leads to a problem, namely that the brain is not simple in this sense, because, as I said, it consists in a multitude of particles that don't disappear into a uniform field. And it seems that the phenomenal realizers of a physical structure must be at least as complex as that physical structure. At least if realization works in the way I described in the beginning of the talk. It works by way of phenomenal properties constituting the relata of physical relations, because then we need to have enough phenomenal properties to constitute the relata of all the physical relations we find in the brain, or one experience or quality for each node in the microphysical structure of the brain. And if there's only one experience, there simply aren't enough of them. So in response to this problem, I think we can just say that fusions don't really need to be simple and partless. Rather, they can be understood as capable of containing a multitude of individual qualities or aspects, as long as these aspects are all unified by a single strong border. And this seems to be how our own experiences are structured. So my experience right now, or our experiences, are all unified by this strong border that separates them from the experiences of all other people. But within this border, we can experience many different qualities at once, so sounds, colors, thoughts, and emotions, and so on. So then you might think that one particle or each microphysical distinction in the brain can be realized by or correspond to an aspect of such a fusion. So then we solve this complexity problem. But this leads to another problem, namely that according to mainstream physics, particles inside and outside the brain have the same structure. So first of all, according to the mainstream view, there are no special fundamental physical relations, such as quantum entanglement, that's confined to just the brain. And there are also no irreducible laws of biology or chemistry and so on that determine that the particles behave differently inside complex wholes, such as the brain, than they do in simple situations that are the domain of physics, such as particles, accelerators, and so on. So the idea is that the laws of physics in principle predict the behavior of particles completely, both inside and outside the brain. So in that sense, they have the same structure. So there's, of course, a lot of legitimate dispute about this, and especially at this conference. But if the mainstream view does turn out to be correct, it leads to a problem for the fusion view. Namely that on this view, the particles inside and outside the brain have different phenomenal realizers. So particles inside the brain are realized by an aspect of a fusion, but a particle outside the brain is realized by its own unfused micro-experience. And one might think that these new realizers should result in new structure. And therefore, if the mainstream view is correct, the fusion view has to be false. So one response to this problem, I think, could be to argue that, to simply argue that the mainstream view is false and that there are special or emergent relations in the brain. And if that turns out to be the case, I think that would be great for the fusion view, and I'm not ruling that out at all. But I also think that the fusion view doesn't depend on this. Because if the mainstream view does turn out to be true, then one could rather say that physical structure is simply multiply realizable by different kinds of phenomenal realizers. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's a common view that consciousness is like software and that the brain is like hardware. And according to this kind of functionalism, conscious states are multiply realizable by, for instance, organic brains and silicon brains. But if we switch this around and say that the physical properties are purely structural and that if consciousness is like their hardware, then maybe physical structure could be multiply realized by aspects of fusions or unfused micro-experiences that have the same causal powers. But this leads to yet another objection, which is that it seems to bring back another main problem of dualism, specifically a problem associated with dualist overdeterminism. And this is the view that a non-physical consciousness emerges from the brain, and that this non-physical consciousness then goes on to cause the same effects or actions that as the brain processes that gave rise to it, so that our actions have two sufficient causes, a mental and a physical one. And this view coherently avoids both epiphenomenalism and violation of causal kosher. But it seems very implausible that a mental emerger should have the exact same causal structure as its physical base. Similarly, the fusion view takes macro-consciousness to emerge from micro-experiences by fusion. And then it says that aspects of this new macro-experience have the same causal structure as the micro-experiences they emerge from. So therefore, one might think that the fusion view is equally implausible as overdeterminism, because they both posit a kind of multiple realization of the same causal structure. So in response to this, I would say that, okay, this is maybe slightly implausible, but still the fusion view is far less implausible than dualist overdeterminism, because in the fusion case, the emerger and the base that have the same causal structure are still much, much more similar. In the dualist case, we have a base that's fundamentally physical and fundamentally non-mental, and an emerger that's completely non-physical and fundamentally mental. And it seems very implausible that two entities of completely different fundamental natures should have the same causal structure. If we have a completely non-physical mental substance, we might expect that to have special mental powers, such as free will, maybe, or special teleological powers, and so on. But in the fusion case, both the base and the emerger are phenomenal and fundamentally mental. And it seems much more plausible that two entities of the same fundamental nature should have the same causal structure. And also, two things that have the same nature can also have, be qualitatively similar. They can resemble in terms of qualities. So, for instance, you might start out with a bunch of unfused micro-experiences that individually instantiate different color qualities or other very basic phenomenal qualities. And then they fuse into a single experience that instantiates similar qualities as aspects. And it doesn't seem that strange that similar qualities will behave the same regardless of whether they are instantiated as an aspect of a fusion or alone as an unfused, in an unfused micro-experience. But if the emerger and the base don't have the same nature as with dualism, then they can't even qualitatively resemble at all. So for this reason, I think the fusion view is far more plausible than dualism, even though one should admit that the multipolarization view is maybe a tiny bit implausible. But one might wonder whether there's something to say that could make the fusion view even more sort of intrinsically plausible instead of just saying that the alternatives are worse. And in the last part of the talk, I'm now going to suggest that it might help to combine the view with the integrated information theory of consciousness, or IIT. And this is a theory of consciousness from neuroscience that was developed by Giulio Tononi. And the central claim of IIT is that consciousness, or unified consciousness, correlates with maximal integrated information. And information measures very roughly how much a system causally constrains its own past and future state, or how internally deterministic it is. And it also takes into account the number of possible states a system can be in. So highly complex systems that are highly internally deterministic in a certain sense will get high information. And then integration measures how much this information depends on the interconnectivity between the system's parts. So conscious systems are not only complex, but also unified by this particular kind of strong interconnectivity between the parts. And then there's maximality, which means that to be conscious, a system must have higher integrated information, or phi, than any overlapping system. So the brain area that correlates with our consciousness must have higher phi than any individual neuron or smaller neuron group that it consists of, and it must also have higher phi than the whole brain and the whole body and society and even the galaxy and the whole universe. IIT is compatible with both panpsychism and the fusion view. First of all, IIT implies something very close to panpsychism, because phi can be found all the way down to the fundamental level of physics in entities such as atoms and protons. Because atoms and protons consist of mutually interconnected quarks or other subatomic particles, and this means that they have a tiny bit of phi, and therefore also a tiny bit of consciousness. And second, because consciousness requires maximal phi, it also follows that macro consciousness replaces micro consciousness. So when atoms form a conscious brain, the brain will get higher phi than the atoms, and the atoms will then lose consciousness as soon as the brain gains consciousness. So combination would work just like the fusion view. Therefore, we can combine IIT with the metaphysics of the fusion view. And this could help rendering the fusion view more plausible in a few different ways. First, we get this very nice systematic principle that predicts when fusion occurs. So instead of saying it's just a brute law that fusion occurs in the brain and maybe other places, one could say that fusion happens whenever a system gets higher phi than its parts, because maximal phi is the single correlate of unified consciousness. So the fusion law could be derived from a single more systematic principle, which makes it look less arbitrary and thereby more plausible. Also, systems with maximal phi are also structurally similar to fusions. So I've claimed that fusions can contain a multitude of qualities or aspects that are unified by a single border. So they have a kind of unity that's compatible with internal variety. And systems with maximal phi also have a kind of unity that's compatible with internal variety, because in systems with maximal phi, the parts are more closely interconnected with each other in a sense than they are with anything else. And this creates a kind of absolute border around the parts of that system that kind of separates this system from all other systems. This means that since the brain contains very high phi, that means there is maybe something very close to physical fusion in the brain after all, even if there is no strong emergence. So it's not a perfect structural match, but it's maybe stronger than we thought we could get. And so these structural similarities between our consciousness and maximal phi is, of course, something that's pointed out by IET itself in its argument from axioms to postulates that I can't go into here, but some of you might be familiar with it. So maybe what I'm suggesting in a sense is that we can combine the arguments for the fusion view with the arguments for IET, and that could support the theory even more. But that said, I also want to note that the fusion view is compatible with other theories of consciousness in neuroscience, so this view doesn't commit you to IET. Okay, so to sum up, panpsychism avoids the main problems of physicalism, dualism, and subjective idealism, which are the epistemic gap, causal exclusion, and anti-realism about the external world. The fusion view avoids the main problems of constitutive and standard emergent panpsychism. It's compatible with the epistemic gap from micro to macro consciousness, and it also avoids explanatory exclusion because the emerger replaces the base. The main problem of the view is that there's no physical fusion in the brain, at least according to mainstream physics. But in response to this, one could say that physical structure is simply multiply realizable by fusions or aspects of fusion and unfused micro-experiences. And I've also shown that the fusion view is compatible with IET, and this gives us something that's at least close to fusion in the brain, after all. So for these reasons, I think panpsychism should be taken very seriously as a solution to the hard problem, and it's not clear that the combination problem is just as hard. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hedda. One way to imagine physically getting the fusions of which you speak is entanglement of quantum variables. Mm-hmm. You spoke of that rapidly. Does that seem like a promising route, or can you realize that it's ruled out on some grounds?
Sorry, can
quantum entanglement might give you the fusions you want,
yeah,
if you can entangle desired sets of variables.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that?
So I'm not I'm not an expert on any of this, but I was from what I've heard, there's an empirical question of whether there is quantum entanglement just localized to the brain, so that there is some quantum entanglement on the macro level, but it extends far beyond the brain. So for that reason, it can't be the correlate of kind of our consciousness. But if it turns out that there is quantum entanglement just localized to the brain, I think that would be a great correlate of fusion, because then that would be a kind of special relation between particles instead of an entirely new thing. So it's better explained by fusion than by the emergence of some kind of entirely new kind of consciousness.
I agree, and allow me one other sentence. When you have entangled variables, they are a new whole, W-H-O-L-E. Mm-hmm. They're no longer separate from one another. So it can answer James' combination problems and your combination problems in principle.
Yep.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, is Stuart Hameroff here, by the way? Yep. Someone's looking for you out here, so come up front.
Sure.
Over
Question?
there.
Very short. Yes or no? Fascinating talk. Thank you. Are you aware of the political and ethical ramifications of your theory and the quandaries that emerge? Just yes or no. Thank you.
Sorry, can you repeat the political ramifications?
Are you aware of the political and ethical ramifications of the theory that you've just proposed and the quandaries that emerge?
So what are those ramifications? Which one in particular?
Yes or no is fine. It's just something to reflect on.
Yeah, I think that's very, very interesting to think about.
Thank
and
you.
I think there can definitely be especially ethical implications.
I was thinking predominantly
but none of them
political.
are follow like very strictly. So there are different ways of interpreting that, I think. But I definitely think that there can be very important ethical implications specifically.
Thank you very
Okay, I think we've got time for one more. I think Jonathan was first.
So I'm having trouble understanding the explanatory exclusion question, and specifically why it is that when the larger fusion takes place, that the individual subconscious experiences can't also have conscious experience. You could imagine individuals doing a video of separate little pixels, and that each one would produce a combined one that someone else could see, but that wouldn't necessarily mean that the individual who is doing the individual video couldn't still be having an experience. And lastly, in the brain, you have different regions processing information at different times. So the color is done before the motor, and so if there were some sort of consciousness, say, to the color sensory system, it couldn't lose its experience because the larger experience would happen before, after the color one had taken place.
Okay, so the second question, I think, yeah, even if there is some processing that leads up to color experience, maybe the correlate of the resulting color experience might be part of a fusion in a different area. If I understand the question correctly, I think that's something I would say. And the other question was why they have to lose consciousness, the microparticles. That's just because we think of this as an emergent view. So if we thought of this as a constitutive view, then that wouldn't have to be the case. But the problem is the constitutive view is that there's an epistemic gap, which I think supports ruling that out. And then, but if we posit that the overlapping experiences are distinct, then there would be causal exclusion.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so for our final talk on Team Pan proto-psychism, we have a man that needs no introduction. Stuart Hameroff has been the heart and soul of this conference. It's way back since the very beginning, 1994, still heroically organizing conference after conference and doing a great job. Today he's going to talk to us about quantum pan proto-psychism, a scientific approach. So please give it up for your friend of mine, the man with the microtubules, Stuart Hameroff.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk about quantum pan proto-psychism, continuing this theme, a scientific approach to the hard problem. What you see in the background of this slide is a series of waves in Peru, the longest left-turning wave set in the world. And because the point I want to make is that when the waves break, they're kind of like collapse of the wave function. And if you look at just at the waves collapsing, you can think of a series of collapses over time. Oops. How do I forward this? It's not forwarding. Do I need the clicker? Thank you. Okay, I want to define pan-proto-psychism. This happens to be a quote from Dave. Fundamental entities are proto-conscious with special properties that are precursors to consciousness and that can collectively constitute consciousness in larger systems, raising questions such as which fundamental entities? Does proto imply a precursor or something of qualitatively the same but lower magnitude? And how does collective constitution occur, similar to the fusion problem that Hedda described? And I will say that quantum coherence and entanglement is the way to do that. Now, most of science sees the brain as a neuronal computer network with a tangle of neurons on the left and a computer node on the right, and that consciousness somehow emerges from complex computation, Bing. And as some of you know, I use Bing to constitute qualia, the hard problem, subjective phenomenal experience, or emojis. Now, neuroscientists, despite that, despite a tremendous knowledge about the brain, neuroscientists, including Christoph Koch, Giulio Tononi, many philosophers, including Hedda and sometimes Dave, invoke panpsychism, suggesting consciousness is a property of matter, that is to say, of atoms. And here we see an atom, and we can imagine Bing at the level of an atom. However, atoms are evanescent, alternating between wave and particle states. Their materialism itself is somewhat suspect, and quantum materialism that Dave mentioned in his talk is an oxymoron. Now, atoms and particles exist in superposition at the micro level. For example, the cesium atom is seen as a wave of multiple possibilities in the background, quantum superposition, and indefinite states and locations in the foreground, classical. But we don't see such superpositions in our perceived world. Experiments in the early part of the 20th century seem to show that superposition persisted only until being measured or consciously observed. This is the observer effect in quantum mechanics. Roger mentioned this morning. Schrödinger thought this idea was absurd and described his famous thought experiment of a quantum system being amplified to trigger poison to kill a cat. And the observer effect would say that until someone opened the box and looked, the cat was both dead and alive. Now, there are several approaches to explain this, and the conscious observer, or Copenhagen interpretation, is one in which conscious observation causes collapse of the wave function. So up here we have our conscious observer. He or she is having a conscious moment. He looks inside the box, and at that instant, the cat is either alive or dead. This was put forth by Bohr, Wigner, von Neumann, Stapp, and Dave and Kelvin McQueen fairly recently. It's somewhat dualist, and it's not objective reduction. And it puts consciousness outside science. Consciousness is used to solve a pragmatic problem, but doesn't really explain consciousness, makes it even more mysterious. Another approach is multiple worlds. Superpositions are separations in reality, and each possibility branches off to a whole new universe. This is a popular idea, but untestable and unnecessary, and actually pretty silly, I think. The Bohm pilot wave, Paavo Pilkkanen is a big proponent of that, in which pilot waves guide the particle. There's decoherence, for example, Tegmark, but it doesn't collapse the wave function, it just kind of buries it in noise, and it may not exist at all and be encompassed by Penrose objective reduction, which I'll come to next. Now, Roger Penrose first dealt with the question of what is superposition. How can particles be in two or more locations at the same time? This is the fundamental question that most people ignore. And he approached it by applying general relativity and saying that superposition is equivalent to separated alternative curvatures in space-time geometry. And Roger showed similar space-time sheets this morning. So here we have time going this way, and one dimension of space, converting 3 to 1, so we can put it on the screen, and a particle here would be this curvature here. A particle moving over here would be a curvature over there. So if you think of this particle oscillating back and forth between the two locations, the space-time curvature is actually oscillating back and forth. Then superposition would be the particles and the curvature being in two places at the same time. So this forms basically a qubit, a quantum bit of two possibilities and a superposition of both, such as is used in quantum computing. Now, if we imagine that each of these possibilities of space-time curvature branched off, then each would form its own universe, and we would have multiple worlds. The multiple worlds hypothesis, which I just said was silly, with multiple parallel universes. But this is how it could happen. Now, Roger said instead that these superpositions in space-time curvature are unstable and will self-collapse, that is to say, undergo objective reduction, OR, at a time t equal to h, Planck's constant, actually over t, Planck-Dirac constant, over E sub g, the gravitational self-energy, the amount of energy required to separate something from itself, or to separate the space-time from itself. And due to an instability in space-time curvature, that at a time t, at this time here, one curvature will cease to exist, the other one will keep going. So if this could be the dead cat and this is the live cat, or the other way around. accompanied by a moment of proto-consciousness, Bing, at the level of space-time geometry. So rather than atoms having a Bing, it's the space-time collapse itself that has a Bing. So Roger essentially turned the Copenhagen interpretation 180 degrees around. Rather than consciousness causing collapse or objective reduction causes consciousness or causes proto-consciousness or is proto-consciousness. I say that because Dave once asked me whether if it was causing it, then it wasn't really the same. And he challenged me, is this an identity theory? And I had to bite the bullet and say yes. So this self-collapse is a moment of proto-consciousness. Now, proto-conscious means it's ubiquitous, random, without meaning or any what it is like to be. And this would be happening everywhere. It'd be happening in the atoms in the lectern, the atoms in the air, and particles throughout your body, outside the brain, pretty much everywhere. And so it's kind of a panpsychist view or pan-proto-psychist view, and that these fundamental, very simple moments of proto-conscious experience are everywhere, ubiquitous. But they come and they go, and they don't add up to much, to anything. There's no memory, there's no meaning, and there's no first-person perspective. They're kind of like, in a metaphor, notes, tones, and sounds of an orchestra warming up. You go to the symphony, and before they start, they're all, each musician is playing his or her instrument, and you hear these notes, tones, and sounds, kind of essentially a cacophony. It's noise, it's discordant. We need something, these need to be orchestrated or combined or fused, as Hedda was saying, for full consciousness. And for that, I think we need entanglement, not only for spatial fusion, but also temporal fusion. Because in the brain, for example, if you look at an object, its shape, color, motion, and meaning are processed in different parts of visual cortex and also at different times. So we need not only spatial fusion, but temporal fusion. And for that, you need quantum entanglement. So the point is that consciousness, full, rich, conscious experience that is orchestrated is more like music. It's not the cacophony of the orchestra warming up, it's the symphony. Or it's actually more like jazz, because you don't necessarily need a conductor, then you'd have a homunculus problem. So it's more like a jam session or jazz or something with improv rather than having a conductor. However, whatever you think of this, OR is the only specific mechanism for consciousness ever proposed. Now, IIT puts a threshold out there, but it could be applied at the level of neurons, or as Tononi has told me, even at the level of microtubules, if there was more IIT and more phi at that level, which I think there would be. Anyway, Roger needed a quantum computational mechanism in the brain which could, one, biologically orchestrate quantum information processing by the Schrödinger equation, that is, make it meaningful and full and rich, halt terminate by Penrose objective reduction, connecting to space-time geometry and non-computable Platonic values, and qualia, awareness and feelings, and also regulate functional neuronal and synaptic activities so that consciousness could control our actions and our behaviors and actually be in charge of things, which we want. Microtubules were the answer. So I had been interested in microtubules for 20 years when I read Roger's book, The Emperor's New Mind, and at the 1994 Tucson conference, we began to collaborate. After the conference, we went to the Grand Canyon. I've shown this picture many times. There's Roger's wife, Vanessa, Jeff Tollickson, me, Seamus, and there's Dave over on the edge. And we had a great time. Anyway, why microtubules? Well, for something quantum, you need something fairly small, and yet able to, and quantum, and therefore very weak in terms of energy and force, able to regulate neurons and control our behavior. So think of the brain as a hierarchy, and we'll start over here with the cortex, with its 6 layers, and it's temporal, it's in the roughly 10 hertz range, and then we zoom in on a pyramidal cell, and we see it here, and it's full of microtubules in the pyramid, and we're down to the, say, 1,000 hertz range when we get into there. And then we zoom in on one microtubule, which operates at 10,000 hertz roughly. And then we go even lower to rows of tubulin in each microtubule, which can oscillate back and forth. And then we zoom inside each tubulin, and we see these pi resonance groups in the aromatic amino acids. And incidentally, this is where anesthetics act. And Travis Craddock is going to talk about how anesthesia acts on microtubules tomorrow, I believe. And then we zoom into these aromatic rings in the amino acids that have oscillating dipoles in the terahertz regime. And this is where anesthesia acts, shown here, to dampen and prevent and block these oscillations. Now, I want to say a little bit about these pi resonance groups because they are the basis for organic chemistry. In the 1700s, chemists knew about the alkanes, these chains of hydrocarbons with carbon and hydrogen, and alkenes, which had a double bond. And they knew these formulas, and they were able to work this out. But there was C6H6, which was different. It was oily and flammable, and they didn't know the structure. And Kekulé had a dream of snakes, these chains being snakes, and one snake swallowed its tail, and he woke up and said, benzene must be a ring, and he was correct. So C6H6 is a ring. It has 3 extra electrons here, which is often shown here as this hexagon. Now, the 3 extra electrons are delocalized, and they form clouds above and below the benzene, shown here. And this is called pi resonance clouds. And these are conducive to quantum effects. And this is also where the type of medium where anesthetics act. So do life and consciousness derive from pi resonance in biomolecules such as microtubules? Well, these things attract and then oscillate in terahertz. If they're right at the van der Waals radius. Benzene in gasoline is just a big mishmash. But if you array it just at right separation or put it in an array like graphene, then it has wonderful and interesting quantum effects. And it can be a qubit also as a quantum superposition. So if we look back to our hierarchy, we would, activities here could be amplified up through the tubulin, the rows of microtubule, coding information in microtubules, controlling the pyramidal cells, cortex, which controls our behavior through outgoing axons from the pyramidal cells. So it's a way of ramping up over 12 orders of magnitude quantum effects in the microtubule, inside the microtubule wall, to control our behavior. So we developed a theory basically where quantum superposition, shown here in microtubules, in many, many microtubules entangled throughout the brain, which correlate with a separation in space-time geometry that Roger developed, reach a threshold by E equals h over t here, and there's a collapse. One of these curvatures ceases to exist. The other one persists. There's a moment of consciousness. Particular states of tubulin are selected, which control our actions. So the collapse is a conscious moment which selects particular patterns of tubulin which can control our actions or give us perceptions, and generate reports based on content in selected information states. And I borrowed that from Dave's talk this morning. I don't see any problem with that in this type of situation. You have plenty of information, in fact, an enormous amount of information in the microtubules in one collapse. And the hard problem, for example, the redness of the rows, which under normal circumstances is thought to be a pattern of metabolic or electrical activity in the brain, Bing, is actually could be seen as the redness of the rows having a particular configuration in space-time geometry, much, much more than 3, which is reproduced in her brain or perhaps directly entangled in her brain. So she has the perception, conscious perception and qualia of the redness of the rows because of the particular pattern of space-time geometry which is recreated or entangled in her brain. So going back to this, and we've just added a graphic in the middle, a graphic way of representing what's going on here so that we can show a series, this Bing should be on the other side, a series of OR moments which the frequency can vary. Here we have it at 25 milliseconds, which was our original view. It's probably much, much faster, like in the megahertz, and which makes it easier to do because you don't have to avoid decoherence or premature OR that much longer. Now, there's evidence for this type of effect in the brain from Anirban Bandyopadhyay, who spoke this morning, but not about this. And he looked at microtubules at 3 scales, in neurons, shown here, in a single microtubule and in rows of tubulins, and applied nanoelectrodes and used 2 to stimulate and 2 to record. And microtubules are good insulators, but he found that when he stimulated them at a particular frequency or particular set of frequencies, they suddenly became very conductive. and then he plotted the conductance and got these triplets of triplets. And they're self-similar over many, many scales, starting from the bottom from terahertz, gigahertz, megahertz, and repeating to kilohertz, and then hertz. So we see this kind of self-similar pattern repeating from the very tiny nanometer scale up to neuronal scale. Now, this type of idea that consciousness is a sequence of events rather than a continuum or anything else is very similar to the ideas of Alfred North Whitehead, who said that consciousness is a sequence of discrete events, of occasions of experience. And here's one representation of that, some using the light cone idea with inputs going to this, and this would be an occasion of experience, and then it generates more information, then there's another occasion, and another, and another, and another. So Whitehead saw consciousness as a sequence of events, of occasions of experience in a wider field of what he called proto-conscious experience. Bing, bing, that's supposed to be over there. So each of these would have a moment of conscious experience. Now, Abner Shimony, a philosopher that I had the pleasure of meeting several times, in 1993 compared these Whitehead occasions of experience with quantum state reductions, that is, collapse of the wave function. So our view of consciousness as a sequence of quantum state reductions is very is comparable to Whitehead, at least according to Shimony. So let's go back to the definition of pan-proto-psychism. Fundamental entities are proto-conscious, and the questions I raised earlier. So which fundamental entities? They would be quantum state reductions, OR events. Does proto imply precursor? Not really. Proto-conscious OR events, which we're claiming are the same as decoherence. It gets rid of the idea of decoherence. What Tegmark and Zurich and all the people who talk about decoherence are describing is better described by objective reduction and these micro proto-conscious moments. They would be ubiquitous, phenomenal, but random, lacking memory, and lacking what it is like to be. They just come and go, and there's no consequence. Finally, how do you combine collectively? This would be by entanglement, coherence, or orchestrated, kind of like music. And I've come around to the idea that consciousness is not so much a computation, but it's more like music. And the brain is not so much a computer as it is an orchestra, with this multi-level hierarchy from the nanoscale and the terahertz, and perhaps even faster in the ultraviolet, and then going even faster and smaller into the fluctuations in space-time geometry. And entanglement solves the fusion problem that Hedda was talking about, or the combination problem in quantum mechanics, in panpsychism rather, both spatially and temporally, because you also need temporal binding to account for binding. So if you see something moving through the air, and you look at its shape, color, motion, and meaning, that happens in different places in the visual cortex to tell you whether it's a kite, a bird, or an airplane. So another point I want to make is that this hierarchy relates to work mentioned by George Ellis and George Mashur earlier in this conference, in which, for example, the top, say cortex, could be the whole brain, moving downward through these multiple levels down to the level of the pi resonance oscillations is top down, but there's also bottom up. But I think it's both. In fact, OR can occur at multiple levels, kind of like music can occur at multiple frequencies and multiple scales in music. So again, an analogy to music, which I've heard a lot of at this conference. So again, does consciousness move up and down in this multi-scale hierarchy like music? Okay, I want to switch a little bit and refer back to yesterday's talks about life and ask the question, which came first, consciousness or life? And in neuroscience, psychology, and most Western philosophy, life preceded consciousness, and consciousness emerged from life at some point in development. And where that is, people argue, recently with tools or earlier in even the origin of life. However, panpsychism, pan-proto-psychism, as well as other views, naturalism, Eastern philosophy, spirituality, Whitehead, and our view, OR, consciousness is intrinsic to the universe. It occurs at a basic level of reality. It doesn't need life, according to this, at least proto-psychism, pan-proto-psychism doesn't. and therefore consciousness preceded life, and I raised the question whether life emerged from consciousness. Now, life on Earth apparently began in a primordial soup proposed in the 1920s by Oprin and Haldane, a simmering mix from which biomolecules emerged, or perhaps from thermal vents, such as Bruce Damer suggested yesterday, billions of years ago. In the 50s, Miller and Urey simulated a primordial soup and found organic amphipathic molecules. So they reproduced the conditions of the primordial soup with clouds and the right ingredients and electrical shocks, sparks for lightning. And when they looked at what was left at the bottom, they found these amphipathic molecules with pi resonance groups on one end and polar, nonpolar, and then hydrophilic polar tails. These are very common in all forms of biomolecules. In fact, they look a lot like dopamine, which is the pleasure molecule. And they have nonpolar oil-like rings on one end and polar water-soluble tails on the other. Now, oil and water don't mix, and the oil-like ends will coalesce and form oil-like nonpolar interiors with the polar ends sticking out. These are, Oprin called these micelles, and this is exactly how proteins fold. The aromatic amino acids stick together with the polar ends sticking out. This work from Arvydas Tamulis in Lithuania shows the nonpolar pi resonance groups in a protein. So it's much more complex than the three I showed in the previous slide. And the same thing happens in lipid bilayers, where you have a nonpolar region in the middle, and DNA and RNA, where you have a pi stack here. And the point is that these regions, these nonpolar pi resonance regions, are conducive to quantum effects. And Travis Craddock and Jack Tuszynski and I have published a paper suggesting that, calling this the quantum underground, with a quantum region defined by the Meyer-Overton correlation of where anesthetics act, of quantum-friendly regions within proteins and nucleic acids and lipids and membranes. So pretty much all different types of biomolecules. And I should also mention that the psychoactive dopamine and serotonin neurotransmitters and all the psychedelics we heard about on Tuesday have fairly complex conjugated pi resonance groups. So meanwhile, back in the primordial soup, imagine that we had an Oprin micelle here that got more and more complex. I'm just showing 3 pi resonance groups, but imagine maybe hundreds or thousands. And over time, and if they would preserve, they would reach threshold and have a conscious moment, bing, back in a simmering mix of biomolecules, and this would correlate with a process in underlying space-time geometry. Now, the qualia feelings of these primitive OR events would be proto-conscious, random and meaningless generally, but occasionally some would be positive and feel good. And this type of feelings could provide a feedback mechanism for organization and origin of life. Now, it's interesting that these pi resonance rings, pi stacks, have only 2 stable arrangements, T-shaped and parallel displaced, and maybe one of these correlates with feeling good and one correlates with feeling bad. I'm just guessing which is which, and it could be a gross simplification, but it could be that qualia derive from collapsing a system to one or the other of these 2 states. And the one with the happiness would provide feedback, and the assembly, I would even call it an organism, that would want more of that. So if we look at tubulin, it has 86 pi resonance rings, and there's where the anesthetics act: tryptophan, phenylalanine, and tyrosine. And therefore, it would have something like 2 to the 86 possible configurations of the pi stacks. And so we would have a whole assembly of possible emojis or qualia coming out from one of these, which would entangle with others to give rise to feelings at a larger scale. So with pleasure as a feedback fitness function orienting pi resonance groups, did life then evolve to orchestrate and optimize OR-mediated pleasure? And I've called this the quantum pleasure principle. And I'm borrowing from Freud, who said beyond the pleasure principle, and quantum might be beneath the pleasure principle. But in any case, it could have played a role. I claim it claims a role in evolution. Now, back in the primordial soup, driven by ultraviolet, terahertz, and cosmic microwave radiation, all of which microtubules resonate to and with. Tubulins could have then formed cylindrical lattices with resonance to optimize pleasure, reaching Bing more quickly and more consistently. The microtubule was born. Resonance led to orchestrated OR, further optimizing pleasure. Now, Dave once told me that people don't like our quantum consciousness theory, and they're really going to hate our quantum evolution theory, or my quantum evolution theory, but I'm going to put it out there anyway. Darwinian evolution is a pillar of modern science, but the notion that life evolved behavior to promote gene survival is an assumption and doesn't make sense. Behavior is driven by reward, pleasure, and avoiding pain. From rats in a lab to our behavior to coming to this beautiful place to hear interesting talks, it's all driven by reward of one form or another. There are no genes in the primordial soup, and evolutionary theory ignores consciousness and feelings, although Darwin did speak of it a lot. So did feelings drive evolution? That's the question I'm putting forth. This is also known as the phenomenal argument in evolution, and I think Hedda has written about this also. So, conclusions. Orca-War is consistent with philosophical quantum pan-proto-psychism, and with evidence for anesthetic action and quantum resonances in microtubules, I'm claiming that Orca-War has more experimental support than other theories and can account for the origin and evolution of life, EEG by beat frequencies of microtubule megahertz vibrations. We hear a lot about EEG. It's very useful clinically. There's still no explanation for what it really is and why and what it means at a deeper level. EEG experts say, no, you can't be right about that, but they don't have a better explanation, so I'd be glad to discuss that. Free will, for reasons that Roger said this morning, and the hard problem. So the final point is that consciousness is a sequence of quantum state objective reductions in the basic structure of the universe, orchestrated by microtubules. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for a couple of questions for Stuart.
Yes, yeah, fascinating and very interesting talk. Thank you. I'm wondering about inside the wave function. Apparently, there is this pan-proto-psychic event or opportunity, the pan-proto-psychic within the wave function. And so my question is, what translates that pan-proto-psychic potential into actual consciousness? What's the mechanism that's going on there?
Orchestration. So the proto-conscious events that are happening everywhere, when they happen in the brain, they are in the microtubules, in and around the microtubules. They're organized in such a way due to resonances and unified by coherence and entanglement into one unified body. But the main thing is they're in a cognitive structure, that is the microtubules, so they have meaning and information representation, and they're orchestrated, using as an analogy from the cacophony of the orchestra warming up to the symphony playing. So orchestration by the microtubule resonances, unification and entanglement to give spatial-temporal unity and binding, solving the binding problem.
Right. Thank you.
I think I want more detail on that. So let's imagine one neuron and 3 microtubules in that one neuron. And let's imagine that that one site, the collapse is, say, red. Its phenomenal character is red. In another one, it's green. In another one, it's blue. What determines whether the activity of that neuron will contribute, you know, blue or red or green to its owner's phenomenal experience?
Well, first of all, you need a lot more than 3 microtubules to reach objective reduction in anything in a reasonable time. 3 microtubules might take an hour, and before that happens, something else is going to mess up. You need, I forget the exact number, but there's 10 to the 19th tubulins in the brain. You need about 10 to the 16th or 10 to the 15th to reach threshold. So that's like a big concentration of the entire brain to reach threshold in a reasonable time. So if you had an isolated neuron with 3 microtubules all by itself, it might reach reduction, have a conscious or proto-conscious moment in an hour or 2. And I don't see how one microtubule would have red and one would have green. They would all have the same sensory inputs. If you gave them all their different sensory inputs, that's a different story, but I don't know how you do that.
Okay, let's take one more and also get Deepak and Hedda up there while this exchange is going on.
I believe maybe you might have answered it. I was just curious if you ever put a number on how many proto-conscious combine to make like a fly's conscious or a lower level conscious. Have you ever put a number to that?
Well, I've thought about the paramecium because the paramecium is a single cell. It doesn't have any synapses. It's not part of a network. It defies the basic AI neural net premise that you need a network of many simple, dumb elements. It swims around, it finds food, it finds a mate, it has sex, it can learn. If you suck it into a capillary tube, it escapes faster and faster. It's got about 1 billion tubulins, and now, whether it's conscious or not, I don't know. I'm just claiming it's cognitive. For it to be conscious, because it would take a fairly long time, and you want to avoid disturbance and decoherence. The only time it's absolutely still, it's when it's having sex with a partner, and it's absolutely still for like a minute. So maybe that's when it has a conscious moment.
Okay, thank you, Stuart.
Thanks.
Okay, now we've got a decent amount of time for a little panel discussion. I thought maybe I could start by seeing if anyone on the panel has questions for each other.
I related to what Hedda had to say a lot. And Stuart, we've been friends for a long time. This connection between what Stuart calls proto-consciousness and consciousness is actually quite sensible in the sense that what most people mean by consciousness is conscious experience. And so proto-consciousness is prior to our everyday experience that we call perception. But we get into conundrums with this because conscious experience is very unreliable. You know, this is, to see that this is reality is naive realism. And I think no one here in this audience would say this is what reality is. It's an experience in human consciousness, which we still can't explain.
Any of you guys want to take that one? Other questions for each other? Okay.
I'll ask Hedda something.
Sure.
Could you apply IIT to microtubules? They have way more information at the level of neurons, and especially when you multiply them by all the neurons. And if that were the case, would that be a victory for IIT or for OR?
If it turns out that there's higher fine microtubules than okay. Yeah. So if it turns out that there's higher phi in microtubules than in the brain, I think that could work for both maybe. But I think given how IIT is formulated now, it's pretty clear that it's going to be in the bigger area, but that it's going to be maybe in the larger area of the brain. But you have to ask Julio about this, I think.
The brain's made of microtubules. I mean, they're everywhere. And if they're entangled, then they form one, they're fused, which is what you want. Yeah. I think for fusion, you need entanglement, as Stu Kaufman was saying.
So depending on how you define orchestration, maybe orchestration can contribute to higher phi, but I'm not sure.
A couple of physicists at Oxford developed quantum integrated information theory, or QIIT. Quit.
They should quit.
Like that one.
Stuart, I want to back up to your very last slide there, where you said OR is compatible with, I guess, the idea of free will. And certainly in Roger's sharing of his epiphany of last night, in his talk, he demonstrated how, in his view, free will at that moment chooses one path or the other from the earlier fork. My question for you, and for anybody else who wants to comment, is I get that, I think, but I'm not clear on from whence still the free will derives. Where is the wiggle room, if you want to put it that way, for such freedom? In OR, is that providing that, or anybody else? That's my question.
Well, I was with Roger. We were discussing this last night. And in 2012, I wrote a paper called How Quantum Brain Biology Can Rescue Conscious Free Will. And the point of that paper was, okay, free will has a lot of issues, including determinism. But before we even get to that point, if you say something and I answer you back immediately, if you or someone were to measure the activity in my brain correlating with what you said, I will have already responded to you. And this is well known. It's been known for many, many years. And accordingly, people like Dennett and most neuroscientists and philosophers say that consciousness happens after the fact, that I respond to you non-consciously due to my autopilot inner zombie, or whatever you want to call it, and then a few hundred milliseconds later, the consciousness happens, and I have this false illusion that I spoke it consciously. Now, the way around that, and if you go back to the experiments of Libet in the 70s, both his move your finger experiments, which are often misinterpreted, or better yet, his sensory experiments where he had patients in neurosurgery awake where he could record from their brain, he figured out there that for the brain, to have sensory perception in real time, when you prick your finger within 30 milliseconds, you have the conscious experience, you need 500 milliseconds of activity. And the brain needs the evoked potential at 30 milliseconds and an ongoing 500 milliseconds of activity to have the conscious experience at 30 milliseconds, which means that the brain must know somehow what's happening in the future. And he concluded that the subjective information was referred backward in time. Now, he was berated and ridiculed and harassed by a number of well-known people and kind of changed his tune, which I think is unfortunate because in quantum mechanics, there's time symmetry. And as Roger mentioned, Yakir Aharonov has this dual vector theory where there's a collapse and there's quantum information forwards and backwards. So if you apply that and say that with each collapse there can be referral of the quantum information backward in what we perceive as classical time, or better yet, as he calls it, temporal non-locality, then the conscious experience can happen at the time that we act, and we're not epiphenomenal. Therefore, we are consciously acting, even though the electrical activity that seems to correlate with that hasn't happened yet.
Okay, next question.
Thank you.
Deepak.
It depends on who is asking the question. When you say, I have free will, what do you mean by I? What is the I that wants to know that it has free will? Now, having said that, I think most people don't have it. Our President Trump doesn't have free will, for example. Because more or less we are all bundles of conditioned reflexes that are constantly being triggered by people and circumstance. So free will is, in that sense, if you look at it objectively, it's not there.
It's somewhat of an evolved capacity.
But if you go to time-symmetric quantum mechanics, then it becomes teleological. The future is determining the present, right? Those weak experiments. So it's a conundrum, as usual.
Okay, over here.
Thank you.
So I want to ask you all about the fusion situation in panpsychism. And in the second talk, you seem to be assuming that consciousness either is on one level or you know, it suppresses the consciousness on the next level down. I'm curious what you think about sort of personal reports that people have of collective consciousness. Either you are, you know, highly related to one person and you feel like your minds have combined in some sense, and there's some higher consciousness that you don't have an awareness of, but that may have its own kind of awareness. And perhaps it happens in larger groups when you have a lot of conscious people in the same room. Feels like it might happen here, actually. I have that sense.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between feeling very connected to another person's mind so that you can maybe represent very, very clearly why or what they're experiencing, and between actually sharing the very same experiences, which is what you need for fusion. So, you know, you could have a view where fusion happens gradually, and that kind of experience would be one sort of step in that direction. But it could also be interpreted as a different thing. That's what I would say.
Oh, okay, Deepak? Okay, you guys want to come in?
If consciousness involves quantum mechanics, then non-local entanglement is possible between people. It opens a Pandora's box to parapsychology and other things, and it's one of the reasons we get so much resistance from the powers that be in various specialties. So entanglement would allow, quantum consciousness would allow entanglement among people.
I think personal consciousness is the entanglement of collective consciousness.
So is there like a collective consciousness right here, right now?
It's on the internet now, the collective consciousness.
Okay, so like the whole room, every internet room?
I didn't say that. I didn't say that.
What's that, you didn't?
No, I said it's possible between people. I don't know what you're thinking right now. I think you can be connected with feelings among people. I think there's a lot of good evidence for that.
But we are entangled. Our minds are relational and embodied. There can't be an embodied mind without the relational mind.
Yep.
I have a comment and a question for Dr. Chopra. So during your talk, you mentioned that in order to solve some problems, we need to transcend science and rely more on our experience. I just want to say I think that's a very dangerous idea to have to prioritize anecdotes over science, especially at a conference called the Science of Consciousness. And now my question is that how is the idea of non-dualism any better or any more valid than solipsism? Because you seem to have the idea that all we have is subjective experience, which is fine. There's, we can only have subjective experience. But instead of saying nothing is outside of that, you propose that there's this extra consciousness that is outside of our own subjective experience. So I'm wondering how it's more valid than that.
Solipsism applies to individual consciousness. When I talk about consciousness, I'm not talking about personal consciousness. I'm talking about impersonal consciousness that modifies itself as species-specific experiences. I also said that science is the best adventure that consciousness has taken. It's the best model we have of reality, but it's still a model. It's a useful, practical construct, useful fiction.
Okay.
I believe in reality. Let me just, and this is a debate going back to Einstein versus Bohr and many others. And Einstein believed in an underlying reality. Bohr didn't care. He just wanted to do experiments.
Thank you.
But
Dr.
who
Hameroff.
or what is doing the experiment? Who or what wants to understand consciousness? What is it that wants to know the nature of consciousness, if not consciousness?
Consciousness, but not necessarily the whole universe consciousness. Not everybody is at this conference. People here are interested in consciousness. Most of the world is out there not even thinking about it.
Thank you. Yeah, Dr. Hameroff, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about the evolutionary basis for consciousness. So once you have the right aggregate of proto-conscious molecules or whatever, how does it go? How does it make the next step of influencing the classical physical world to direct its own evolution?
I have a paper I'd be happy to send. I mentioned it during the panel yesterday. It's called The Quantum Origin of Life, How the Brain Evolved to Feel Good. And it's basically, I gave you the nutshell of it, that in the primordial soup you had this basically micelle formation with the nonpolar centers, which when they got large enough would have quantum effects, which would eventually reach threshold, and they'd start to have very simple proto-conscious moments. And some of them would be pleasurable, and that would provide feedback to this system. I won't even call it an organism. I'm not sure what to call it. A micelle, Operin called it, and a feedback fitness function to develop and self-organize in such a way as to optimize feeling good. And, animals and humans and behavior isn't really, okay, it's to survive and to have offspring and this and that, but it's really to feel good. I mean, procreation is largely about feeling good, I have to say.
Hi, I have a question about this fusion model. It struck me, it seems very promising, but it struck me as it doesn't escape epiphenomenalism. If I understood it correctly, if this whole idea of multiple realizability, if the same causal dynamics of the brain are realized with this fusion the same causal dynamics would be realized if the fusion simply hadn't taken place. Mm-hmm. Does the fusion have any effect as a fusion? And if not, why do we think it happens?
Yeah, I think there's a sense in which something else could have done the same job, but I don't think that makes it epiphenomenal. So if you think about something in our world that clearly has a causal effect, such as, like, let's say a stone crushing something, there could have been different laws of nature so that something else crushed that thing. But that doesn't mean that the rock was epiphenomenal, because under the current laws, that was the thing that was doing it. In the same way, there are these laws that say that, okay, two things can behave similarly, but in this case, it was this thing. So it's not epiphenomenal, even though there's a certain kind of counternomic scenario where it could have been different.
But it doesn't have it doesn't do anything uniquely by virtue of being this big, large, simple, the fusion thing. It doesn't have any particular powers by virtue of that the little things couldn't have had on their own.
Yeah,
Does the big fusion make you say, I am conscious, when the little things would not have?
Yeah, I think if you take the fusion view and the multiple realization part, there's this sense in which it's your individual experiences that are sort of determining what you're doing, and maybe not the fact that they're fused. There's a sense in which that doesn't make a difference. But if it turns out that the microphysical world is causally closed and that everything is determined by the laws of physics, I think that's just, if that's how it turns out to be empirically, I think every theory of consciousness has to reflect that in some way. So it's not something that can be explained away. Yeah.
This is a question for Dr. Hameroff. Okay, so I'm thinking about Fight Club. I am Jack's quantum wave function in Jack's microtubule. Why am I proto-conscious? How did I get to be proto-conscious without strong emergence?
You're not proto-conscious, you're orchestrated, you're fully conscious. Proto-conscious is what's happening in the table and everywhere else throughout your body other than your brain. In your brain, all these proto-conscious, proto-events are orchestrated and organized, combined, fused, bound, however you want to put it, into a unified wave function so that they're one. You know, quantum mechanics gives you the opportunity for many particles to condense into unitary features. For example, Bose-Einstein condensation. Somebody mentioned Ian Marshall the other day, and he had a theory in 1988 of self and unity and binding due to Bose-Einstein condensation in the brain. He was also at the first Tucson conference. Maybe Dave remembers him. But you know, he didn't have a good biological model, but it was really very prescient of him to say that. So quantum effects give you the binding. So you're not proto-conscious, you're fully conscious, at least I assume you are.
Well, when I say I'm from the point of view of the wave function that is going to collapse in the microtubule. And from Roger Penrose's model of, you know, the state is selected as a proto-conscious event inside of the wave function, apparently. The proto-conscious event happens in the wave function, is that correct?
The proto-conscious event is the collapse of the wave function. So one of the possibilities ceases to exist, and the other one manifests in classical reality, at least until it goes into another superposition. He said proto-consciousness, I think, applied to the little space-time curvatures, but if you think, you know, which is one fundamental unit, depending on what it is that's causing the curvature. But if you have, you know, gazillions of that, I can't think of the number offhand, that would give you enough information to have a conscious experience like we're having many, many times a second. That's fully conscious and orchestrated objective reduction, not proto-conscious.
Stuart, can I ask you, when you say proto-consciousness, do you mean the potential for conscious experience?
The potential for full, rich conscious experience, but it's happening everywhere without us.
Thank you all for your, thank you all for your fascinating insights. I was wondering about how the effects of experiences in virtual and augmented realities affect your frameworks of consciousness. So in my own perception, I've noticed like technology's manipulated my memory or my sense of time. But you could even say like a passive introvert in reality could be an aggressive extrovert in World of Warcraft.
Augmented reality and VR has immense implications for medical applications. When you can give somebody an experience of what normal is, you can treat them for diseases like anorexia, even autism. When you have a child who has facial expressions that are not emotionally resonant, if you give that child the feedback of normal facial recognitions, then neural networks start to rewire that. So I see in the future going to a physician with any disease, chronic illness, cardiovascular disease, instead of getting a prescription, you'll have a session with augmented reality.
Okay, just time for one or two more.
I have a question for Dr. Hameroff. If there are primordial soups on other planets that create similar organic molecules as the ones created on Earth, then wouldn't quantum states self-propagate life based on the pleasure feeling? And why do we have so much difficulty finding life outside of Earth if the theory is correct? Or do you believe that there is a lot of life that we just can't find?
I assume there must be, you know, somebody was telling us, maybe it was Deepak, how many billions of galaxies there are. It's almost inconceivable that there wouldn't be the right conditions. On the other hand, you never know. You know, the anthropic principle says that our universe is a 1 in a gazillion shot to have the dimensionless constants exactly right to have light, life, and consciousness. But we don't know what the physical constants are in other galaxies. Presumably they're the same, and if that's the case, then there should be the same conditions there. You know, you don't know about atmospheres, but and other conditions. But with all those, some of them should support life. Why they haven't revealed themselves, or why we haven't found them, who knows?
Well, there's a discipline called astrobiology. There are departments of astrobiology, Columbia, Harvard, MIT, San Diego. And according to astrobiologists, based on biosphere guesstimates mathematically, there could be 60 billion habitable planets in our universe, 60 billion. But again, that's conjecture. And why can't we find them? They're light years away. You know, even to go to an exoplanet next door, you have to go light years away.
Okay, last one over here.
Thank you. I have a question about how experience realizes the physical structure of an object. I probably don't understand panpsychism, but here it goes. Panpsychism states that an object has experience, not based on an observation we make, but because it needs its experience to realize its physical structure in order to exist. So because I know that the object exists, it has to have experience. But if an object is just its own structured experience, how is it accessible to me? How can I know anything about the relations between the private experiences of the object?
You know about the relations the object has because it affects you. There are causal relations to you and also causal relations to other things that affect you. So you can derive its structure from its interactions, and then you infer on the basis on analogy with yourself, kind of what kind of intrinsic nature it has. Does that answer the question?
Thank you. I have trouble understanding how I can access the relations between things to which I don't have access, but maybe I'll think about it some more. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks to all of you.